But setting the stage, we already talked about two of the main actors, um, the Persians and the Romans and the Persians. But let's focus on them first. Who are the Eastern Byzantine Romans, and why do we use this distinction, Eastern and Byzantine, to describe them? And did they see themselves in the East as being different from its counterpart in the West? Because I feel like these terminologies can be very confusing for people.
Yes, the terminologies are the products of scholars looking at the field and trying to divide it up. The East Romans were Romans. They'd lost control over the West in the late 5th century, but then in the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian, through a series of sort of probing expeditions, manages to recover much of North Africa, Italy, and some of Spain. So in the 6th century, it's back again to being a Roman Empire, straddling the whole Mediterranean. Then in the late 6th century, ground is lost in Italy to the Lombards.
Hmm.
North Africa is all right. It's all right. It's reasonably stable, though there were pressures from without, from Berbers. Where they were really losing ground was in the Balkans, but they're still Romans. So they've got the Roman constitution, Roman culture. They've got the East. The language of the East had always been Greek. The language of the West was Latin. So Greek is becoming more important. So they're basically Romans, and they go all the way back to the early empire, and then before that to the Republic. So with continuous history, continuous development from the 6th century BC, 5th century BC.
And would that be the same for the Persians, the Sasanians, being that the Parthians were before them? Were they a continuation of the Parthians?
Yes, they were, but they were rebels against the Parthians. They basically saw themselves as restoring the Persians proper. Now, Persians proper come from, Persia proper is a particular region within Iran on the edge of the Zagros, centered on basically where Persepolis where Persepolis is. So it's basically southern southeastern Iran.
Persepolis is the capital Cyrus established.
The great yes indeed. And then there's that wonderful site of Pasargadi, where Cyrus's tomb stands up, and you can see it silhouetted against the landscape. So it's the area. So Isfahan is there. I'm trying to think of what the chief city. I suppose Isfahan is probably the chief city now. So basically, it was a resurgence of Persia proper, and the small dynasty based there, which was both aristocratic and the Zoroastrian priesthood, engages in a campaign which gathers strength as it proceeds, and succeeded in imposing their authority over the whole of Iran, and then over much of what is now Iraq, in about 20 years in the early 3rd century. And they were consciously restoring a great Iran. But the funny thing against the Parthians, and the Parthian state was rather loosely organized, and was, occasionally was beaten by the Romans. So this was a stronger, more centralized Iranian state. And they're recreating something great that had existed before the Parthians. But funnily, they didn't have a clear view of the Achaemenid Empire, the great Achaemenid Empire of the 6th and 5th and 4th centuries AD. They sort of, that got subsumed into an imaginary Chianid Empire, which was even greater and even more powerful. But they're recreating so there's continuity on the Iranian side as well.
Okay. And the Sasanians, they were more militaristic than, because of their geographical location, they had to be militaristic. Am I understanding that correctly? Because they have
they're caught between the Romans, the Roman Empire, which is a militaristic power, though relatively stable and not expansionist in late antiquity. They're caught between them and the greater nomad powers that were emerged within the steppes to the north and the east of Iran. And I'd say that Iran, the principal the problem came from the north and the east. So it came from Huns and their successors, Kidarites, and their successors, Hephthalites, and their successors, Turks, who established their authority over much of Central Asia, where so it's now ex-Soviet Central Asia, where there were major cities. So it's not just nomads; it's nomads and sedentaries and great trading cities. So the great power in their own right. So the Iran, Sasanian Iran, had to cope with them and cope with the Romans.
You know, I really didn't know how powerful the Central Asians and steppe people were until I had read a book by Frederick S. Starr, the Lost Golden Age, where he gives the pre-Islamic history of Central Asia. And you had mentioned in your book that the Sogdians had helped or the Turkish Khaganate was involved with Sogdians and others.
In effect, they co-opted the elites of the Sogdian cities, and there are numerous cities, large trading cities, and these are basically mercantile elites. So they're sort of co-opted into running the Turkish Khaganate, and the Sogdians had trade connections, with the Far East, with India in the south, with the north, and with the West, though the Sasanian merchants, of course, were rather suspicious of them. And so that creates tension.
Okay, so we just introduced another actor, the Turkish Cognate, who seemed to be a thorn in the side of the Sasanians, or a group of people the Sasanians were definitely weary about. Now moving further west, we have the Avars, who are antagonistic to the Romans, or the Romans are having trouble with the Avars.
Yes, the Avars established themselves in what's now Hungary. The Avars, it looks as if the Avars were the defeated the great power of the East Asian steppes, the Juan, whom the Turks defeated and superseded. And this is a little fragment of that world that's fled west and ended up fairly safe behind the Carpathian Mountains in Hungary. And they then establish their authority over the Slavs who were moving into the Balkans.
Okay.
They're a major power from the antagonist of the Romans, but on nothing like the same level as the Turks, as an antagonist of the Iranians.
Which will explain what